October 25, 1944, dawn breaks over the Philippines. The humid air is still. A thin mist rolls over a battered airstrip near Luzon. Young pilots, barely 20, kneel beside their aircraft, their breath trembling in the chill of morning. Mechanics finish tightening bolts and painting crude cherry blossoms on the fuselages of worn-out Zero fighters. A priest murmurs quiet prayers. Paper headbands marked with the rising sun flutter in the wind. From the command tent, Admiral Takejiro Onishi watches in silence. He knows what he has unleashed and what he can never take back. The men bow deeply. Engines roar to life, echoing across the field like a dirge. Far away, aboard the USS St. Lo, sailors stand on deck, scanning the pale horizon. Radar blips flicker. Calm voices pass through intercoms. Incoming bogies, bearing 180. No panic, only precision. Gunners adjust, helmets strapped tight. Moments later, the sky splits open. The first kamikaze dives, a white streak against gray clouds. Onishi whispers the words of the ancient code. Those who fear death have already lost. But what he is about to witness will challenge that belief forever. By mid-1944, Japan's empire stood on the edge of ruin. For 3 years, it had fought an industrial giant half a world away, and the balance had finally shattered. The victories of 1941 and 1942, born of audacity and surprise, had turned to ashes. One by one, the Pacific strongholds, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, fell under relentless American assault. The ocean that once belonged to the rising sun was now a graveyard of wrecked ships and burning skies. Tokyo's maps told a story no admiral wished to see. Fuel reserves could last only a few more months. Steel production had collapsed under the weight of Allied bombing. Pilots, once the elite of the Imperial Navy, were now hastily trained boys with fewer than 100 flight hours. Japan still commanded courage, but it no longer commanded time. Within the high walls of the Imperial General Headquarters, a dangerous idea began to take shape. If Japan could no longer match American industry or technology, perhaps it could overwhelm their spirit. The nation turned inward, to its oldest code. The concept of Bushido, once the way of the samurai, resurfaced with brutal clarity. To live without honor was worse than to die with it. Generations of warriors had embraced death as a duty. Now, in 1944, that ancient creed became state doctrine. Newspapers, schools, and radio broadcasts repeated the same message. The Americans fear death. We must teach them courage. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, a seasoned naval officer with a sharp, disciplined mind, had long believed in the psychological power of sacrifice. He had seen his fleet shattered at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where hundreds of Japanese aircraft were annihilated by American fighters and flak. The enemy's calm precision had haunted him. His pilots had fought with passion, but passion alone had not saved them. In the halls of despair, men like Onishi found a grim logic. If a single plane, guided by a pilot willing to die, could destroy an American carrier, then perhaps Japan could still turn the tide. Not through numbers, but through fear. Meanwhile, the Americans moved with machine-like determination. Admiral Chester Nimitz's island-hopping strategy cut through the Pacific like a steady knife. Each captured island became an airfield, each victory a stepping stone toward Japan itself. Their power was not in emotion, but in organization. The quiet efficiency of thousands working toward a single goal. On the front lines, U.S. sailors began to notice a shift in their enemy. Japanese attacks were growing more reckless, fighters diving directly into gunfire, bombers refusing to break off their runs. At first, they called it madness. Later, they understood it was something far darker, a deliberate embrace of death. In Tokyo, propaganda glorified these deaths as divine acts. The term Tokubetsu Kogekitai, special attack units, appeared in military dispatches. To the public, they were given a simpler, older name, kamikaze, divine wind. It was a word rooted in legend, the typhoon that centuries earlier had saved Japan from Mongol invasion. Now, leaders invoked that same myth to promise salvation once more. As American bombers thundered toward Japanese cities, the myth became a weapon. Radio voices spoke of American fear, of soft men who fought for pay, not honor. The admirals believed it too. They imagined that the sight of men willing to die would break Western morale, that calm discipline could not survive the horror of suicide attacks. They were wrong. But in the summer of 1944, no one inside Japan dared question the logic of death. The empire's survival seemed to depend upon it. Onishi and his peers convinced themselves that spiritual power could overcome material weakness, that the West, in its comfort, had lost the soul to resist. And so, as the tide of war closed around them, Japan prepared to test that belief in the most absolute way imaginable, through men who would trade their lives for impact. The belief was set. The doctrine was written. Now came the moment when that idea left the briefing room and climbed into the cockpit. October 1944, the final convulsions of the Japanese Empire began. The Allied advance had reached the Philippines, a vital chain that connected Japan to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. If the Philippines fell, Japan would be cut off from its last lifeline of fuel. Its navy left to wither in port. To defend it, the Imperial Navy assembled nearly every ship still capable of sailing. Battleships, cruisers, carriers, destroyers. An armada born of desperation. The operation was codenamed Shogo, Victory Operation. But deep down, even its architects knew the truth. This was not a plan for victory. It was a plan to die fighting. Admiral Onishi, commanding the 1st Air Fleet, arrived in the Philippines on October 19th. The airfields were in chaos, bombed daily, short of fuel, full of exhausted crews. The Japanese Army and Navy bickered over command. Planes lay broken on the tarmac, stripped for parts. In that bleak landscape, Onishi made a decision that would define him forever. He summoned his officers and spoke quietly. There was only one way left to strike at the overwhelming American fleet: deliberate suicide attacks. If one plane can sink one ship, he said, then with 10 planes we can destroy 10 ships. His words were not shouted, not emotional. They were clinical, as though death itself had become a line in a ledger. The 1st Kamikaze Special Attack Unit was formed that day. 24 volunteers from the 201st Air Group, stationed at Mabalacat Airfield on Luzon. Their squadron leader, Lieutenant Yukio Seki, was a skilled pilot and newly married. When told of the mission, he hesitated, but when asked if he would accept the honor, he bowed. "If the Emperor commands it," he said, "then I will do it." There was no turning back. The preparation was ritualistic. The chosen men were given a final meal of rice and miso soup. They tied white headbands, hachimaki, around their foreheads, each bearing the red circle of the rising sun. Letters were written to mothers, wives, and fiancés. Photographs were taken beside aircraft decorated with flowers. To an outsider, it might have looked like celebration. In truth, it was grief disguised as duty. On the morning of October 25, 1944, the 1st Kamikaze Unit launched from Mabalacat. Their target, the American escort carriers supporting the landings at Leyte Gulf. U.S. Task Unit 77.4.3, codenamed Taffy 3, was composed of small, vulnerable ships providing air cover for ground troops. The attack came suddenly. American radar picked up low-flying bogies approaching from the north. Anti-aircraft guns opened up, tracers streaking across the sky. But one plane, Seki's, broke through. Witnesses aboard the USS St. Lo later described a single zero emerging from the smoke, diving steeply, wings leveled, engine screaming. The pilot never wavered. Seconds later, the aircraft smashed into the flight deck. Its bomb detonated deep within the hangar. At 10:51 a.m., the St. Lo became the first major warship in history sunk by a kamikaze. The explosion tore through the carrier's decks, igniting fuel and ammunition. Within 20 minutes, the ship rolled and went under. 113 sailors were killed. The sea boiled with fire and oil, and somewhere above, Onishi received the radio report. Enemy carrier destroyed by Special Attack Unit. Tokyo erupted in celebration. Newspapers hailed the birth of a new weapon. The Shinpu Tokubetsu Kogekitai, the Divine Wind Special Attack Force. Propaganda broadcasts declared the Americans terrified, their morale broken. The image of the kamikaze, fearless youth plunging from the sky, became a symbol of hope for a dying empire. More units followed. Within weeks, hundreds of volunteers were training for one-way missions. Some were veterans. Many were students barely out of school. The training was simple. Take off, navigate to target, and dive. Mechanics filled planes with just enough fuel for the trip. Survival was neither expected nor desired, yet behind the triumphal headlines, quiet doubts began to spread. Even among senior officers, many knew the math. Japan could not build planes fast enough, nor train pilots fast enough to make suicide attacks sustainable. But the leadership had crossed a moral threshold. To question the tactic now was to question the very spirit of Japan. And so, the doctrine hardened. By the end of 1944, the kamikaze had become Japan's most frightening and tragic weapon. Not because it was powerful, but because it was unstoppable. In the months ahead, this weapon of faith would meet a new kind of enemy. One that did not panic, did not break, and did not run. The Americans would face death with a calm that defied everything Japan believed about them. They were not madmen. They were not monsters. Most were boys who had grown up in a nation where death for the emperor was the highest honor imaginable. By 1944, Japan's education system had become a weapon in itself, teaching children that the emperor was divine, that dying for him was the purest act of loyalty. Many of the first kamikaze pilots came from universities. They were poets, writers, students of philosophy. In letters discovered after the war, their words reveal an agonizing clarity, an awareness that their mission was not glorious, but futile. One wrote, "I do not wish to die, but if my death can protect my family from invasion, then I accept it." Another confessed, "I feel no hatred for the Americans, only sadness that we must meet as enemies." They lived in a society where hesitation was betrayal. Officers watched for any sign of doubt. To refuse the mission was unthinkable, not because of punishment, but because of shame. In the code of Bushido, to die willingly was strength. To survive when others died was weakness. On the airfields of Kyushu and Luzon, the rituals were always the same. Pilots drank sake before takeoff. Some tucked locks of hair or fingernails into envelopes for their families. Others carried small dolls or amulets blessed by Shinto priests. The flight line was silent except for the roar of engines. Then came the final salute, a raised hand toward the rising sun. No one spoke of return. Psychologically, the kamikaze were the ultimate expression of Japan's wartime identity, a fusion of devotion, fear, and fatalism. They believed that by destroying themselves, they could awaken fear in an enemy who, in their eyes, fought only to live. But they misunderstood what they were about to face. Japan's air technology had once stood proud. The Mitsubishi A6M0, when introduced in 1940, was a marvel. Light, agile, and deadly in dogfights. But by 1944 it was obsolete. Its armor was paper-thin, its fuel tanks unprotected, its speed far below the new American Hellcats and Corsairs. In ordinary combat, the Zero had become a death trap. The kamikaze program turned that weakness into a perverse advantage. The aircraft's fragility no longer mattered, because it was never meant to return. Pilots removed unnecessary gear to lighten weight. Explosives replaced secondary fuel tanks. In some cases, the nose was packed with a 500-kilogram bomb, designed to detonate on impact. Japan's engineers also began creating purpose-built suicide aircraft, like the Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, nicknamed the Baka bomb by Americans, Fool. It was a human-guided rocket, carried under a bomber until release. Once the pilot ignited its engines, it became a living missile, capable of over 600 miles per hour. There was no steering back, no escape. Meanwhile, on the American side, technology was the exact opposite. Calm, methodical, layered in defense. The U.S. Navy's radar systems aboard destroyers and carriers could detect aircraft more than 100 miles away. Fire control directors automatically tracked altitude and range. Anti-aircraft guns, from the rapid-firing 40mm Bofors to the 5-inch dual-purpose cannons, formed a deadly wall of steel. Where Japan relied on spirit, the Americans relied on science. Every new attack led to new adjustments: better radar filters, faster coordination, more disciplined gunnery. When the first kamikazes appeared, many U.S. sailors were shocked, but not for long. Training and routine took over. Radar pings, bearing calls, the roar of anti-aircraft batteries. It became a rhythm, mechanical yet human. They did not meet death with hysteria. They met it with procedure, and that calm precision would prove stronger than any code of honor. On board the American carriers of late 1944, fear was real, but it was controlled. Sailors watched the skies day after day, knowing that each dot on the horizon could be death descending. Yet discipline held. Aboard the USS Essex, an officer recalled, "The first time you see one coming, your stomach freezes. The second time, your hands move before your brain does." That was the essence of the American reaction. Action without panic. The Navy had built a culture of trust, in radar, in leadership, in each other. Every gun crew knew their sector. Every officer knew his protocol. Even as kamikazes dove from the clouds, there was no shouting chaos, only voices calling out calmly through intercoms. Bearing 270, closing fast, open fire. To many survivors, that calm was not courage in the traditional sense. It was something deeper, a collective steadiness born of training and faith in system. They did not believe they could avoid death. They simply accepted its possibility and kept working. This unnerved the Japanese command. Reports from captured prisoners, radio intercepts, and reconnaissance all told the same story. The Americans were not demoralized. They mourned their dead, then rebuilt and continued. The fear of death that Japanese propaganda promised to exploit was nowhere to be found. Instead, the opposite appeared. A relentless, procedural calm that absorbed every blow and grew stronger. The kamikazes' sacrifice did not weaken their spirit. It tested it and proved it unbreakable. The human heart, the machine, and the mindset had all been revealed, but deeper forces were at play. Leaders wrestling with faith and guilt, enemies rethinking honor itself. Takejiro Onishi was no fanatic. He was a career officer, educated, disciplined, and once deeply skeptical of fanaticism. Yet by 1944, surrounded by ruin, he chose to believe that spirit could succeed where steel had failed. His decision to create the kamikaze special attack units was not made in rage, but in sorrow. Witnesses remembered him as quiet, polite, and haunted. After the first kamikaze success at Leyte Gulf, Onishi congratulated the surviving crews, but his eyes were distant. One pilot later recalled that the admiral bowed deeply before them, saying, "You have done a great thing for your country." Then he turned away, tears visible. To the high command, Onishi became both hero and scapegoat. The propaganda machine glorified the kamikaze as divine warriors, but within naval circles, many officers whispered that the tactic was madness, an admission of defeat disguised as honor. Still, Onishi pressed on, not out of cruelty, but out of belief that Japan's moral strength could outlast American machines. He often said, "I do not order these men to die. They choose to." Yet every man who chose did so under the crushing weight of expectation. By 1945, the kamikaze campaign had grown beyond his control. Hundreds of pilots died each month. The results were mixed at best. The Americans adapted, the ships endured, and Japan's desperation deepened. Onishi could not stop what he had begun, not without condemning thousands who had already died believing their deaths were meaningful. In the end, he carried that burden alone. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, Onishi wrote his final note. "To the souls of the special attack pilots, I apologize sincerely. I wish that the young people of Japan will find a more peaceful way to serve their country." He then performed seppuku, the ritual suicide he once glorified, without a second. His death was slow, taking nearly 15 hours. He refused painkillers. He wanted to suffer, as they had. The enemy angle, redefining courage from the American side, the kamikaze was something new, something beyond military logic. It was not just a weapon. It was a message. Each attack said, "We are willing to die to destroy you." But the Americans answered that message in their own way, by refusing to panic. For the sailors of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, courage was not about embracing death. It was about enduring it. They did not see heroism in self-destruction, but in survival, in keeping the ship afloat, in saving wounded men, in returning fire even as the deck burned. Reports from the time describe astonishing discipline. On April 6, 1945, during the Okinawa campaign, the carrier USS Bunker Hill was struck by 2 kamikazes in quick succession. The explosions killed nearly 400 men. But within minutes, firefighting teams had contained the blaze. The ship survived. A lieutenant wrote in his diary that night, "They wanted to scare us, but the more they came, the steadier we got." This calm baffled Japanese intelligence. Their psychological operations had assumed that Western soldiers, fighting far from home, would crumble when faced with certain death. Instead, the Americans seemed to grow colder, more mechanical, their morale paradoxically hardened by the very terror meant to break it. To them, courage was not emotional. It was procedural. Every man had his station, every gun its target, every casualty its replacement. The Navy's chain of command functioned like a living organism. Even as men died, the system survived. The Japanese had sought to prove spiritual superiority. What they discovered was that calm, not passion, was the deadliest force of all. The moral, philosophical angle. Fear, death, and the meaning of honor at the heart of the kamikaze legend lay a question as old as war itself. What is fear? To the Japanese wartime mindset, fear of death was weakness, a symptom of Western materialism. To die willingly was purity. But the Americans inverted that equation. They feared death, yes, but they faced it anyway. That difference proved decisive. In the Japanese code of honor, emotion was sacred. In the American code, control was sacred. One sought transcendence through sacrifice. The other sought victory through endurance. Both believed themselves brave. But only one philosophy could sustain an empire built on logistics, not mysticism. After the war, Japanese philosopher Ichiro Hatoyama wrote, "Taminatwiliwaziridan, We confused courage with escape, escape from living with defeat. That realization would shape Japan's post-war soul. The kamikaze was not simply a military tactic. It was a mirror held up to humanity's extremes. It asked what happens when devotion outweighs reason, when a nation's spirit is harnessed not to protect life, but to sanctify death. In the end, both sides revealed different truths about fear. The Japanese showed how belief can make men fearless. The Americans showed how discipline can make men unbreakable. And when those two definitions met, one burning, one calm, the myth of spiritual superiority began to crumble. Belief had collided with reality. Now came the storm, the great test of both courage and calm. The Battle of Okinawa, where thousands of kamikazes would descend, and the Pacific would burn like no battlefield before or since. April 1945. The sea around Okinawa turned into a furnace. For the Japanese High Command, this was the final defense of the homeland. If Okinawa fell, the path to Kyushu and to Tokyo would lie open. The Imperial Navy was shattered, its carriers sunk, its submarines cornered. All that remained was air power, and men willing to die. In March, Admiral Onishi ordered the largest wave of suicide missions in history, Operation Kikusui, or Floating Chrysanthemum. Over the next 2 months, more than 1,500 kamikaze sorties would launch against the American invasion fleet. The American task force off Okinawa was vast. More than 1,300 ships stretched across the Pacific horizon. Carriers, battleships, transports, destroyers, each one a target. The U.S. sailors had already heard the stories from Leyte. Now they would live them. It began on April 6th. Radar stations aboard the Picket. Destroyers, the Navy's early warning line, began, reporting massive inbound formations. Blips filled the screens. The reports sounded unreal. 50, 80, 100 aircraft approaching simultaneously from the Japanese mainland. The sea erupted. The destroyer USS Bush was hit first. A Zero screamed out of the clouds, trailing smoke. It struck amidships, detonating the boiler room. Within minutes, the ship was aflame. Her sister ship USS Colquhoun was hit moments later. Both went down, their wreckage drifting amid oil and fire. But the Americans did not waver. Every radar plot, every gun mount, every damage control crew moved with relentless precision. Voices stayed calm on the intercom. Orders were crisp. Even as explosions rocked decks, there was no hysteria. On April 7th, a second, larger wave came. Nearly 350 aircraft. The sky over Okinawa turned black with flak. From the gun decks of the USS Bunker Hill, sailors watched tracers arc like burning threads. Kamikazes dove singly and in pairs, some exploding mid-air, others striking home. Each attack felt personal, a single man's final choice colliding with the machinery of an empire. At 10:02 a.m., a Zero slammed into the USS Hancock, killing 62 men. Minutes later, another smashed into the USS Missouri, the same battleship that would later host Japan's surrender. The impact was fierce, but the armored hull held. Crewmen found fragments of the pilot's uniform embedded in the deck. They buried him at sea with full honors. Then came May 11th, the most devastating strike of the campaign. The carrier USS Bunker Hill, flagship of Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, was struck by 2 kamikazes in rapid succession. The first hit the flight deck, igniting parked aircraft. The second tore through the hangar, detonating fuel and ammunition. Firestorms raged across the ship. More than 390 sailors were killed, 264 wounded. For hours it seemed she would join the Pacific graveyard, but she did not. Through smoke and flame, the crew fought back. Fire teams crawled across molten decks, dragging hoses and extinguishers. Medics worked in suffocating heat. When the fires finally died, the ship was scarred and silent, but afloat. Mitchell refused evacuation. He walked the deck barefoot among the ruins, nodding to his men. "We'll live," he said quietly. It was the essence of American endurance: shock, pain, recovery, repetition. Every ship hit became a lesson, every survivor a teacher. The fleet grew more efficient with every tragedy. For the Japanese, the losses were catastrophic. Each kamikaze meant one aircraft, one pilot, one life. Resources Japan could not replace. The results were uneven. Some ships were sunk, but most were damaged and repaired. The tactic inflicted pain, but not paralysis. Still, on the Japanese mainland, radio reports turned every hit into triumph. "One plane, one ship," the announcers cried. The public believed the ocean was littered with American wrecks. In truth, the U.S. fleet continued to advance. American sailors learned to read the signs of attack: sudden radio silence, blips on radar, the faint drone of engines. They developed new defensive formations: destroyers positioned on the outer ring to absorb the first wave, combat air patrols circling constantly overhead. Pilots flying Hellcats and Corsairs hunted kamikazes before they reached the fleet, while gunners below refined their aim through endless practice. Each wave of kamikazes was met with a wall of steel, discipline, and smoke. By the end of April, the American lines around Okinawa had absorbed more suicide attacks than any force in naval history, and still held. What Japan had meant to terrify became, instead, a test that forged the Americans harder. For every ship burning, 10 more pressed forward. For every fallen sailor, 100 took his place. The Japanese admirals had believed that fear of death would break the American will. But here, amid fire and chaos, calm had become the Americans' greatest weapon. But the storm was not over. As May turned to June, the suicide attacks intensified. More planes, more deaths, and one final reckoning that would shatter Japan's faith in the divine wind forever. May 1945. The skies over Okinawa became a crucible of fire. Operation Kikusui entered its final phase. Nearly 1,500 kamikaze sorties had already been launched, yet the Americans pressed forward with relentless calm. Radar picked up incoming aircraft hours in advance. Anti-aircraft gunners, now trained to instinct, opened fire with terrifying accuracy. The Japanese admirals watched the reports and could scarcely believe the results. Ships burned, yes, but the fleet endured. On May 11th, the USS Bunker Hill had survived its devastating double strike. Crews patched decks while keeping guns manned. Elsewhere, destroyers and escort carriers, smaller and more vulnerable, absorbed multiple hits, yet continued to operate. Each loss was tragic, but no panic followed. The Americans did not waver. The scale of destruction for Japan was staggering. Pilots trained for one purpose, machines stripped for ultimate sacrifice, lives extinguished in seconds. The Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, intended to pierce armor like a living missile, often fell short, shot down by American fighters before reaching its target. Many times, a single plane's death achieved nothing but the pilots. Yet, the propaganda machine continued to glorify each loss. Admiral Onishi, once confident in the doctrine, began to despair. He had unleashed young men into a storm that could not be contained, and the results were brutal, empty, and insufficient. His faith in fear, the belief that Americans would break at the sight of death, proved false. Each day brought new reports. American ships repaired, crews resilient, morale unbroken. On May 16th, Onishi convened a council of senior officers. He admitted privately what had long been obvious to the few who dared whisper: the kamikaze tactic could not win the war. "We have given our youth to the sea," he said, voice breaking. And still, the enemy sails on. By late May, Japanese naval air strength was nearly annihilated. Hundreds of planes destroyed, thousands of pilots dead, and Okinawa still held by the Americans. The divine wind had burned, but it had not turned the tide. Onishi could no longer bear the weight of responsibility. On July 16, 1945, he wrote a final note addressed to the souls of the kamikaze pilots. To the souls of the special attack pilots, I apologize sincerely. I wish that the young people of Japan will find a more peaceful way to serve their country. He then performed seppuku, the ritual suicide he had once sanctified. Hours later, his body was discovered in a quiet room, a man broken by the very honor he had imposed on others. Across the Pacific, American sailors remained steadfast. The final kamikaze waves of June 1945 inflicted damage, yes, but failed to achieve strategic effect. Ships were repaired, casualties mourned, and yet the fleet pressed onward, every wave teaching new tactics, improving coordination, and hardening morale. The psychological reversal was complete. Japan's belief in spiritual supremacy had collided with American endurance and calm. Where Japanese doctrine glorified fearlessness, Americans demonstrated that measured discipline could be even more formidable. The mystique of the divine wind shattered against unshakable order. Historians would later note that the kamikaze attacks, while terrifying, revealed a critical truth. Sacrifice alone cannot overcome organization, technology, and human resolve. The Americans did not fear death, but neither did they glorify it. They faced it, contained it, and continued. By the end of the Okinawa campaign in June 1945, the numbers were staggering. Over 3,800 kamikaze sorties launched, 1,000 Japanese pilots killed. U.S. Navy losses: 34 ships sunk, 368 damaged, more than 4,020 und 5,700 sailors killed. The numbers tell only part of the story. For Japan, each pilot's death had been an offering, a sacred attempt to bend reality to spirit. For the Americans, each attack became a test, met with methodical, unwavering calm. And in that clash of wills, one truth emerged clearly. Courage is not measured by willingness to die, but by the ability to endure in the face of death. Okinawa ended, but its lesson reverberated across the Pacific. The kamikaze, once the ultimate symbol of fearlessness, had met the unyielding, relentless calm of an enemy who refused to break. The stage was set for the final chapters of the Pacific War. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the surrender of Japan, and the reckoning of a nation's belief in honor and sacrifice. The collision of faith, fear, and endurance was complete. From the fire and ruin of Okinawa, Japan's myth of the divine wind had been irrevocably tested and found mortal. The Battle of Okinawa ended in June 1945, but its scars would last a lifetime. For Japan, the kamikaze had been a desperate gamble, a final weapon wielded by men who had no choice but to die. Over 3,800 sorties had been launched in less than 3 months, consuming the last remnants of Japan's air strength. Every pilot lost represented not just a life, but the years of training, fuel, and hope that could never be replaced. The material toll was immense. Hundreds of aircraft destroyed, hundreds more expended in failed attacks. Entire air groups vanished from the Imperial Navy's roster. The psychological cost was equally devastating. Families mourned sons, brothers, husbands, and fiancés who had died in missions glorified as heroic but were strategically ineffectual. Survivors struggled with guilt and shame. Those who had volunteered yet survived were haunted by the memory of their fallen comrades. For the United States, the story was different. The fleet suffered 34 ships sunk and 368 damaged, with over 4,900 sailors killed. Yet, in the scale of industrial power and manpower, the Americans absorbed these losses and continued to advance. The calm endurance of crews, the discipline of radar operators, and the efficiency of repair teams turned tragedy into routine. Every attack was a lesson in resilience. Every strike against the fleet a test of methodical human and technological coordination. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. Japanese commanders had assumed that the spectacle of suicide would fracture Western morale. It did not. American sailors reported initial terror, then adaptation, then mastery. Witnesses described how the first kamikaze attack created shock waves of fear. But by the third and fourth, gun crews were methodical, and radar operators expected the planes as a matter of course. Fear, the Japanese believed, could be harnessed. But calm, they realized too late, was stronger. For the Japanese high command, the outcomes were harrowing. The doctrine of Bushido, when applied to the kamikaze, failed to achieve its intended purpose. The Americans had neither fled nor crumbled. They had endured and adapted. By the end of the campaign, Onishi's creation, once hailed as a weapon of divine power, had become a symbol of desperation. In Tokyo, propaganda initially celebrated kamikaze successes, yet intelligence reports told a more brutal story. Hundreds of planes destroyed yielded comparatively minor strategic gains. For every ship sunk, dozens of attacks failed. The scale of sacrifice was unsustainable. By June 1945, the Imperial Navy had lost nearly all operational aircraft, and the kamikaze program, once Japan's final hope, was effectively spent. American records captured this paradox. Survivor interviews revealed the sailors' reflections. Fear existed, but it never dictated behavior. Sailors watched friends die, decks ignite, and ships buckle under impact, and still they performed their duties. They salvaged, repaired, and launched planes again. One officer wrote, "The more they came, the calmer we became." Every loss was tragic, but it taught us to be unbreakable. The kamikaze campaign, while tactically destructive, also marked a turning point in naval warfare. It demonstrated the limits of human sacrifice against industrial might and technological superiority. Japan's reliance on spirit over logistics could not halt the relentless advance of a system that combined discipline, coordination, and endurance. By the summer of 1945, the Pacific War had reached a critical stage. The Americans had proven their ability to withstand the ultimate test of fear. Japan had proven the courage of its youth and the tragic futility of its desperation. For Japan, Okinawa was a moment of reckoning. The kamikaze had been the ultimate test of faith, honor, and sacrifice, and it had failed to achieve its intended purpose. While thousands of young men had given their lives willingly, the enemy fleet remained largely intact. Ships were repaired, airfields rebuilt, and morale undiminished. In the months following the campaign, the Japanese Navy was effectively shattered. Entire air groups, once considered elite, had vanished. Experienced pilots were gone. Ships capable of defending the home islands were too few to matter strategically. The final defensive gambit of Japan's naval command had failed, not because of a lack of courage, but because courage alone could not substitute for resources, training, and industrial might. Culturally, the kamikaze left a deep imprint on Japan's collective memory. For decades after the war, society grappled with how to honor sacrifice without glorifying futility. Monuments rose on Okinawa and at former airfields, commemorating the pilots who had died. Memoirs and letters revealed the complexity of emotion behind the myth. Love, fear, loyalty, doubt. These young men had volunteered, often under pressure, believing their deaths were necessary. Their memory became both a symbol of devotion and a cautionary tale of national desperation. For American sailors, the kamikaze attacks were a defining test of endurance and composure. Survivors spoke repeatedly of the surreal horror: planes diving into ships, flames spreading across decks, men screaming. Yet in every account, a recurring theme emerged: calm, methodical response under extreme stress. Their experience reshaped naval doctrine, emphasizing radar coordination, fire discipline, and damage control procedures that remain foundational to modern naval operations. Psychologically, the clash between kamikaze and American calm revealed something deeper. Japan had believed that fear of death could be weaponized, that Western soldiers would break before the spectacle of self-sacrifice. They were mistaken. The Americans did not glorify death, but they endured it, systematically, relentlessly. This endurance became a weapon more powerful than any aircraft or bomb. It neutralized the kamikaze not with counterattack, but with unwavering composure. The human cost was staggering. Nearly 3,000 Japanese pilots perished, along with thousands of sailors and civilians caught in the crossfire of a war reaching its terminal stage. On the American side, nearly 5,000 sailors were killed, with many more wounded. Ships were damaged or destroyed, yet fleets remained operational, ready for the next battle. The balance of psychological and material power had decisively shifted. In the post-war years, reflections from both sides shaped a complex legacy. Japanese veterans and families mourned the loss of youth and potential, often questioning the strategic wisdom of the kamikaze program. American veterans honored the skill, bravery, and endurance of their own comrades while recognizing the tragedy of men sent to die with little hope of achieving strategic effect. The encounter also left a broader lesson for military and historical analysis. Fear, bravery, and honor are not universal. They are cultural constructs. Japan's devotion to death could inspire awe, but it could not overcome the steady, organized calm of an opponent trained to meet terror with method. Courage, it seemed, could be defined not by the willingness to die, but by the ability to endure and act when death was certain. Okinawa and the kamikaze campaign became a mirror for humanity, a reflection of devotion, desperation, endurance, and adaptability. It showed how belief can clash with reality, and how unflinching composure can counter even the most extreme acts of sacrifice. By August 1945, the Pacific War would end. Japan surrendered. The myth of the divine wind remained powerful in memory, yet its effectiveness had been irrevocably tested and found insufficient. History would remember both the heroism of those who flew into the sky with the intent to die, and the resolute calm of those who survived, repaired, and pressed onward. The final question remained: what does it mean to face death? And what is the true measure of courage? The answer lay not in fire nor in sacrifice, but in the enduring human capacity to remain calm, purposeful, and resolute when the storm arrives. The kamikaze were not invincible, nor were they invulnerable. They were young men, facing the sky with engines roaring, hearts racing, and a nation's hope pressed upon their shoulders. They believed that death could shape reality, that courage could bend fate. In their final moments, they were sublime. Human devotion distilled to its most extreme form. Yet history would show that courage alone is not enough. The Americans, standing on deck amid smoke, fire, and screaming engines, demonstrated a different kind of valor. It was quieter, slower, less visible, but no less profound. Calm precision, methodical endurance, and collective resolve proved more powerful than individual passion. One side sought to terrify, the other chose to endure. One burned with intent, the other remained steady, unshakable, and inexhaustible. The collision of these philosophies left an enduring lesson. Fear cannot be weaponized without understanding the mind of the enemy. Devotion cannot replace preparation, and the human spirit, whether embracing death or surviving against it, remains the most unpredictable element of all. Japan's pilots left behind smoke trails in the sky and letters in the hands of grieving families. They left a memory that inspired awe and sorrow. The Americans left ships repaired, protocols refined, and an understanding that courage is as much about discipline as it is about heart. In the end, the kamikaze campaign was both heroic and tragic. It was a testament to faith, an experiment in desperation, and a stark reminder of war's moral complexity. The rising sun of the Pacific War faded, leaving behind burned decks, empty cockpits, and the enduring question, what does it truly mean to face death? Perhaps the answer is not in sacrifice alone, nor in fearlessness, but in the calm, deliberate confrontation of reality, and the choice to act, even when everything is lost. And so, from the ashes of the divine wind, history remembers both the fire that sought to break men and the unshakable calm that refused to yield.